Hello and welcome to the fourth part of our lecture on ethics. In this part of the lecture, we'll discuss the concept of ethics in science. So what we talked about previously, how is that applicable in science? Now, science is obviously a very diverse field, and as we said before, ethics are usually guidelines that apply to a specific group. So also within science, you have different people doing different types of research, so there is also different types of guidelines. Now, it would obviously be impossible to insert all these guidelines and all of science into one small part of a lecture. So what I did here, or what I'm going to do here in this part of the lecture, is explain you on a more general level what are the checklists you should adhere to, what are the key values of proper scientific conduct, and I will point you towards some guidelines and some websites and some organizing bodies within the UM and within the Netherlands and within the European Union, where you can find info on how to properly behave as a scientist. Now, ethics in science and proper responsible conduct of research is based on a few key moral principles. Obviously, there's honesty. Like in real life, you strive to be honest in all scientific communication. You do not fabricate results, you do not fabricate data, you do not fabricate methods, procedures, and your publication status is also very important. You try to take publishing articles as seriously as possible because that is the way you communicate results to the outside world. And obviously, the status you build up doing this is also valuable because people will rely on that status to judge whether or not a study you do is justifiable or is valuable. Also, do not modify or misrepresent data, and obviously do not deceive colleagues, research sponsors, or the public. Like I said, when you're doing that, fabricating data or fabricating or boosting your publication status, you're actually deceiving the public. And the public is obviously, us as a scientist, we don't live at the outskirts of society, we live in society, and society pays us to sustain society. So you have a moral obligation towards society, at least is what I feel. So, uh, in doing so, be honest and make sure that you don't make the results look better than they are. That's basically what honesty means when you're a scientist. Then there's objectivity, right? Like there is bias, like you can be biased in your experimental design, in the analysis of your data, and definitely the interpretation of it in peer review. For instance, you can peer review a paper by a friend of yours. Obviously, that can lead to bias, personal decisions, grant writing, expert testimony, and other aspects of research where objectivity is expected or required. Now, technically, all aspects of research require objectivity, but we're people. We're not always objective, and there is always the possibility of bias. So, to avoid or minimize the chance of bias or self-deception, disclose whenever there is a personal or financial interest that you might have when you have to do a certain task. For instance, when you're peer reviewing the article of a friend, don't do it. Just say to the publisher, no, I can't because I didn't publish with this person, but I studied with him. I can't be objective towards that person. Or for instance, I can't be the reviewer of this project because we're also doing a similar study in our lab. So I have all means of rejecting it and publishing this stuff myself because I have financial gain for that. So I don't want to do that. Again, if you have, for instance, stock in Pfizer, you're not going to do the clinical studies for the vaccine because you can make money out of it. So disclose this financial interest, disclose this possible bias, and try to avoid it as much as possible to be as objective as. Then there's integrity. Obviously, integrity is keeping your promises and agreements, act with sincerity, strive for consistency of thought and action. Now, this is something very vague, maybe, but integrity is maybe the most important value in this checklist. I think integrity also refers to be honest with yourself, right? Like when you're doing something and you're using an animal model to study a certain disease, be honest with yourself. Do you need these animals? Are you minimizing damage to these animals? And can you do it with another model? I mean, like, can you do it? Not is it easier to do it with animals? Stuff like that is extremely important in ethics and science because I feel if integrity is what you have, then all these other things like objectivity and confidentiality will follow naturally because confidentiality typically usually refers to protecting confidential communications papers or grant that you submit for publication, personal records, trade or military sequence, or patient records. Now, whenever you have patient data in a study, you should have a certain plan on how to handle the data, go to an ethical committee, and let your plan be assessed, and then they give you the green light or not. But if you're integer and you think about everything already, then probably the confidentiality is something you respect anyway. Likewise, openness, be willing to share your data, results, IDs, tools, and research. Be open to criticism and new ideas. That means, like I said before, the public is funding you, so there is a new movement going on in science that's focusing on open access publishing, meaning that you publish an article on the website and you don't need to be at the university, or you don't need a prescription, or you can't, or you don't have to pay for the article to read it. It's open access. Everybody all over the world can read it. And this is important because obviously this shows you that you're open to criticism, but you're also open to showing your data to non-peers and whatever that might mean. Now, two other important aspects that are very important for you guys, obviously, is respect for intellectual property. Now, technically, that means to honor patents, copyright, and any form of intellectual property, but also to not use unpublished data of your peers, methods, or results without permission. And whenever you do cite something that's not your work, always give proper acknowledgement by, for instance, citing the source that you use for that. So never ever plagiarize. And that's very different. That's very important when you're writing a peer review report, when you're writing an essay. Do not just copy paste stuff from websites. Read it, interpret it, take home what you want to take home from it, and then integrate it into your work. But use your own words to do so, and refer to the ID, to the place where you took the ID from when you integrate an ID into your own work. Then obviously there is non-discrimination. I think at Maastricht University, discrimination is not tolerated. And I think in science in general, non-discrimination is important. You did not discriminate against colleagues or other students based on sex, race, ethnicity, or other factors that are not related to scientific competence and integrity. I mean, this goes without saying. It's even illegal to do so anyway. So, uh, nevertheless, very important, of course. Now, what is the consequence of why is it so important that you have ethical guidelines? I mean, we'll discuss some ethical case studies in the last part of the lecture to see like what happens when you don't. But in general, the consequence is that you have public resources, right? And by forging data or not being honest about it or doing an unethical study and having all the data banned, you're actually wasting your own time, your own energy, but also public resources. In terms of like in the case of you as students, plagiarism seems like a trivial thing, but victims of plagiarism did a lot of work publishing their IDs, and now they're denied credit where credit is due. So, for instance, when you write an article, you integrate an ID and you don't cite the source where you get the ID from, they will miss out on citations, and those citations obviously belong to metrics that people can assess to see how impactful your research is. So, their research seems less impactful than it is. Now, then there's also on a more spiritual level the reputation for science and scientific research is damaged, and that seems also again trivial, but it's very important, right? Because whenever there's like a research scandal in the news, that's when people go out and say like, see, we shouldn't trust science, right? Like scientists are also humans, they also plagiarize, they also have these financial gains, and for instance, you see that nowadays is very important. I think in the day and age of fake news around vaccines, that people use scientific misconduct to show that we shouldn't trust scientists, while scientists, of course, and science and scientific research as a whole in general is very trustworthy, right? It's the best source we have for the truth. And then there's actually the last part, and you'll see that also in the last part of the lecture, is actual harm to patients, animals that you use when doing science, and that should obviously always be avoided maximally. Now, you as a student, if you detect plagiarism fraud while doing a peer review, you should always alert this. And when we, as tutors, see a case of plagiarism, we will always hold back your grade. We will still grade the exam or the assignment that you did, but we will hold back the grade. We will forward the case study to the Board of Examiners. You get a meeting to allow you to defend yourself, and you can have your parent, your advisor, a lecturer, or somebody you trust at the university to back you up during the meeting. And you can request that minutes are taken during the meeting. And then the BOE will take the case into account, what the tutor said or what the course coordinator said about the potential plagiarism case, what you said in your defense, and they will come up with a decision. For instance, like you will fail the course, or you will get expelled from school, or um, we will let you go off with a warning. At this point, you get a letter, and then you can still accept or deny the letter, and you can point out inaccuracies. So usually what happens is you fail the course or you're excluded from exams, but in very severe cases, you can also be excluded from programs. So try to avoid plagiarism, try to avoid misconduct, and just try to be as sincere as possible, as integer as possible, because it's important, like we discussed already, but also for yourself specifically. If you have egocentric motives, at least do it for yourself. Don't plagiarize. Now, what if you are just starting to learn the hang of what you're doing in the lab and you're confused, right? Like you're doing research, your supervisor is telling you to use mice, an animal model, but you're not really sure if we're using mice correctly, or your supervisor tells you to process data in a certain way and you say like I'm not experienced enough, but I feel that the way we're processing and showing data is not okay. At this point of your scientific career, it's okay to be in doubt, right? That you don't know yet because you don't have the experience yet. But when in doubt, always ask your research supervisor to help clarify the issue before doing it. Say, like, maybe you didn't think about that. Your lack of knowledge can and will be used against you if you are reported. So it's better to be safe and sorry and discuss these type of doubts you have with your research supervisor. Now, if you don't, right, if you can't because the research supervisor is the one being ethical, there are certain checkpoints, right? There are centralized agencies that have legal power and check for scientific misconduct. There's research ethics committees. There is a research integrity officer and a committee for scientific integrity at UM you can contact. And there's other members of the research community. For instance, like you use the peer review system, you can always also search for a lecturer that you trust and say like, okay, this is a problem. I noticed that there's some misconduct. How can I report it? Other possibilities are when on a more general level later on in your career, you want to do a study, you can also ask your co-authors. Now, if you want to learn more about scientific misconduct, you can find the UM Codes of Conduct and Regulations, but also the Netherlands Code of Conduct for Scientific Integrity online through these links right here. Likewise, if you want to search for the Office of Research Integrity, because like I said before, you're doing something that you feel is unethical, you can't talk to your research supervisor about it, go to the Office of Research Integrity, which you can find through this link right here.